Application and allegorization. Daniel's choice to continue to pray to the God of Israel, rather than holding off for a month, as commanded, was not an act of belligerence toward the king or the laws of the land. Certainly, his regular prayers to God had safeguarded him from the, quote, corrupting influences of Babylonian culture, unquote. However, he may also have felt that to hold off for a month was to offend the very being who had placed him in, and sustained him in, his position of power in the government. Dare he try to succeed in his government post alone? Quote, Daniel could not compromise. For him, the issue was whether he was going to please man or obey God. Daniel had to choose between loyalty to his Lord and obedience to a sinful government commanding him to perform idolatry. So he was willing to risk his life for the Lord, trusting him for deliverance, even as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been delivered years before, unquote. As a modern example of this same approach to faith, leadership, and the risks posed, consider the experience of President Ronald Reagan. As governor of California, Reagan had a spiritual experience in which he believed he was told by God that he would become president of the United States. Consequently, Reagan felt like his election was a calling from God, and thus he felt he had a duty to testify of God in his position. For example, after securing his party's nomination on July 17, 1980, Reagan said to those gathered in the convention center, quote, I'll confess that I've been a little afraid to suggest what I'm going to suggest. I'm more afraid not to. That we begin our crusade joined together in a moment of silent prayer, unquote. Reagan lamented, quote, Not enough of us use our talents and our positions in testimony of God's goodness. He added, My own prayer is that I can perform the duties of this position so as to serve God, unquote. Because he believed that he had been called to the presidency by God, Reagan frequently and openly spoke of God when he gave speeches. One source noted that, quote, the presidential handwriting file at the Reagan Library is filled with examples of religious phrases and verses handwritten into speechwriters' texts by Reagan, unquote. When he would review drafts of speeches that his speechwriters had composed, the president was known to heavily edit them, inserting statements about God and Christ. Reagan was frequently and aggressively criticized for his openness about his belief in God. For example, one Soviet news analyst condescendingly noted, quote, Whenever Mr. Reagan delivers a speech, he always mentions his religious feelings, unquote. The New York Times and the Washington Post were particularly critical of the president's tendency to use, quote, religious statements in his public discourse, unquote. For instance, the Times said that the, quote, only appropriate venue for the types of remarks that Reagan regularly made was in church, unquote. Quote, You don't have to be a secular humanist to take offense at the display of what, in America, should be private piety. It is an offense to Americans when the president speaks that way, unquote. Similarly, on February 13, 1984, a reporter from Knight Ridder, the second largest newspaper publisher at the time, took Reagan to task for his outspoken Christianity and his divisive preaching of the gospel of Christ from the Oval Office. To this, Reagan responded that he felt, quote, There is a responsibility in this position to do those things, unquote. Reagan wore the criticisms by the press as a badge of honor. There is a lesson to be learned from men like Daniel and Reagan. Both knew that God had blessed them and positioned them, and both felt a duty to live faithful